Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. We are deep into January now, and a lot of you have already made detailed plans about what you want to read this year. Although I've been thinking a little bit about that question myself, I got so intensely sideswiped by a work thing that I've not yet gone into any detail here on BookTube about my various ideas, but I thought I would try today. First, let me say that today I want to talk primarily about big personal projects, not larger BookTube events this month or coming up later this year. In general, I'll address that as each month rolls around. An exception is Historathon. I'll be making a video about how I might participate probably next week. I always read a mix of new books and old books. Old books in the sense of backlisted or classic works, but also in the sense of not new to me, that is, rereads. And for the last year or so, I've been more pulled to rereads than usual. One reason for that, I suspect, might be to provide some sort of stability in a time that feels distinctly unstable. But I'm also finding myself with a yen to read some classics I have not read in many years. Ones I read as a teenager and during my early 20s. Many of them I have not read in the intervening decades, and reading them now may bring back some old memories, but I think in general it'll be reading them with essentially fresh eyes. The plot points that most intrigue me, the characters with whom I might identify, the themes that jump out at me, all are likely to be radically different. Perhaps more importantly, I have a much more comprehensive understanding of literary history than I did when I was 18 or thereabouts. That background might make it easier to see how these books fit into the big sweep of literature. So let me talk a bit about some of the personal reading projects that have been rattling around in my head lately. First is an author-based focus on Eudora Welty, an author I have loved since I was a teenager. I started this focus during my Bookukkah period in late December, and I'll try to leave a few links down in the description box. Back then, in those videos, I talked in detail about a couple of Eudora Welty's short stories, more casually about her novella The Ponder Heart and its fascinating connections to the genre of mystery and crime stories, and also about my love of her writing memoir, One Writer's Beginnings. I also talked a bit about Welty's photography and how it might have contributed to a way of seeing, an approach to her characters and stories. But that is just the beginning of Welty, of course. Sporadically throughout the year, I hope to look back on her other novellas and novels, including The Optimist's Daughter, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1973. I'll also chat about her beautiful garden and possibly read through some of her captivating correspondence, collected in several different volumes, at least one of which was very recently published. The next personal reading project is not on an author, but on a specific book. I want to do a serious deep dive into Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, possibly making 6 or so videos discussing each section in some detail. Last year, in some video we made together, Steve Donahue suggested I schedule the read in the month of June and call it June Eyre. So I think that is what I will do. I hope some of you will join me in reading or rereading the novel, perhaps more closely than you have before. Okay, the other reading projects I have in mind are a little more conceptual, not about particular authors and their works, but about time periods and places or big themes. First, because of the 250th anniversary of the start of the United States, I'm interested in reading American classics. This year, I want to focus on 19th century authors, especially from New England, including Emily Dickinson, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Louisa May Alcott, Nathanial Hawthorne, and Herman Melville. Now, these are overwhelmingly rereads for me, some recently and some not for a very long time. And one of them I have not actually read in its entirety. Can you guess which one? As another booktuber said recently, maybe Erin Fisher, when talking about his own reading, Moby Dick is the white whale for quite a number of us. I think I read a dramatically abridged version when I was young, and I definitely read bits here and there when my son was in high school. He absolutely loved the book, calling it his favorite for quite a while. It's time for me to finally read the entirety of the book. Incidentally, I'm looking forward to catching up and then following along with the BookTube channel Robin Song Reads as Dickinson leads us through the novel. Another potential reading project this year. One of my local friends and I have been talking about reading some of the short stories and novels of Virginia Woolf together. We'd pick our text, read individually, and then get together at the end of the month at a tea shop or a cafe to talk about what we've been thinking about as we read. A little in-person book club of two. As it turns out, I signed up for an amazing once-a-month online class talking about the theme of rooms in Woolf's various novels. And the very small class turns out to be made up primarily of Woolf scholars from around the world. I still haven't even read some of Woolf's better-known novels. This might not be the class intended for me, but I'm loving it. This is definitely the year to devote some time to Woolf's fiction. I also want to read some nonfiction works by both Woolf specifically and literary modernism in general. And after pondering what I wanted to do with modernism this year, I stumbled across two group year-long slow reads of early modern works, both run primarily on Substack, and I got really excited about both. Let me go back. Early modern literature has nothing to do with modernism. It develops basically hand in hand with the printing press. Renaissance thought is spreading humanism throughout the West. Although Shakespeare is probably the most famous early modern author writing in English, right now I want to focus on two early modern English authors with whom I'm far less familiar. Both of these authors I want to read this year focus on similar themes or questions. Both are writing in verse and are clearly interested in classic literature of the past, the epics of the Iliad and Dante, etc. They're interested in national identity. Both ask questions about the appropriateness of monarchy. And both are addressing the split between Catholicism and Protestantism. The first is Edmund Spenser, author of The Fairie Queene. The Substack slow read is led by Cait Murphy-Hill, who is starting her PhD with a plan to focus on Spenser. Although the reading project is run on Substack, she also has a YouTube channel called Cait's Corner, the Renaissance Academic. I initially got interested in reading The Fairie Queene back when I was a youngster, watching a television show based on the mystery novels of Robert B. Parker called Spenser for Hire. The main character always clarified the spelling of his surname, Spenser with an S, like the poet. He was also quite a chef and loved the cookbooks of Julia Child. My understanding was that The Fairie Queene was not particularly approachable to unknowledgeable readers like me, and so I was thrilled to see this scholar-led group announced. The second year-long readathon I want to participate in is of Milton's Paradise Lost, and it's led by a new PhD who has both a Substack and a YouTube channel called Glutenberg Bible. In case you're wondering, I gathered that she worked in a bakery and that she reads the Bible as literature, not as a personal statement of faith. I've read quite a few sections here and there over the years from Paradise Lost, but not the whole of it, and I'm looking forward to it. While Milton's text is not a quick read, it's dense and requires more concentration than most of my usual reading, it still seems like something I'm basically prepared for. Both of these early modern books, as I said, are slow, year-long reads. So far, I've been doing some preparatory work on both books, as well as starting the assigned reading for the first month. I'm totally fascinated by both and really have been intrigued by how they speak to each other. More about that as I go through each month. Even before I heard about these two early modern group reads, though, I long had it on my 2026 calendar to read some of Geoffrey Chaucer, an author who was really pre-early modern, but not by a whole lot. Anyway, I want to read the Canterbury Tales, at least partly in the original. I've read many of the stories before, but usually I've read them randomly at different times, separated from each other. And never have I even tried to read the original, although my mother used to recite the prologue in the original. Instead, I always read adaptations into contemporary English. But this year, I want to get a real taste of the original prose, and I sought out a version that had the Middle English on one side and the contemporary text on the facing page. My hope was to find one considered fairly faithful to Chaucer, ideally using his basic patterns of meter and rhyme, and it looks like I found one, the edition put together by Sheila Fisher. For those looking for the complete text, Fisher's version will not meet your needs. This edition is just a selection, although it's fairly extensive, certainly enough to get a good start on reading Chaucer. I'd also love to read Marion Turner's masterful biography of Chaucer. This would be a reread. I read it and adored it when it first came out, but without really knowing Chaucer's tales well. Another of her books, a deep dive into the Wife of Bath, actually has kind of a meaningful place in my life. And perhaps I'll tell that story when I get there. Okay, I was intrigued to realize that both the translation I had picked and the biography I already loved were written by women. I laughed to myself for a moment, thinking about the possibilities for the reverse of BookTube's Women in Translation project, focusing on works by women that were translated into English by anyone. Instead, how about classics, ancient works written by anyone up through early modern works, translated by women? So a new project was born. Actually, I started thinking about this kind of project more than a year ago. Right as I was contemplating picking up Chaucer in this particular way, I'd been reading a bunch of translations and discussions of Gilgamesh, a real favorite of mine for quite some time. Gilgamesh had been especially on my mind since I'd heard, or rather misheard, Michael K. Vaughan talking about his project Sumerian September. With my mistaken understanding, I made a video. I'll link to it. I was fascinated looking at all the different translations I could find. Gilgamesh is a short enough work that I could read several of them, and it really struck me that there were a variety of different styles of translation. One was to try to be as precise as possible in the translation of each and every word. Another was to try to convey the story in something of the way that original listeners would have heard it, not necessarily in exact meaning of each word, but in style and tone and larger theme. Yet another approach would be to try to make the text as accessible to modern readers as possible, perhaps through language, but perhaps by drawing attention to what makes Gilgamesh feel immediate and fresh today, etc. I tried to find examples of each style, some brand new and some among the first published English translations of the epic, and some of those early translators published using initials rather than first names. And then, as I was reading the About the Author section at the end of most of the books, it became clear to me that a lot of the translators and scholars of Gilgamesh were women. I was surprised by the high percentage. I didn't have time to delve into that back when I was just trying to make that joke of a video about Sumerian September, but it stayed in the back of my mind ever since. So I think I'll want to start the project comparing a bunch of translations of Gilgamesh by women. And then go on to Homer, his Iliad as translated by Caroline Alexander, and the Odyssey translated by Emily Wilson. Wildly, My first read of the Odyssey was in the translation by Enos Reese, not a terribly popular one, because he was a visiting scholar at the small school in North Carolina where my father taught. Then a little later, when I was actually old enough to understand a bit more, I fell in love with the classic Fagles translation. And since then, I've read some of Fitzgerald and Lombardo, etc., when my son was in school. As I remember it, Lombardo was his favorite, but I haven't read Caroline Alexander's version at all, and I've only read parts of Emily Wilson's version of both epics. Although I have a ridiculously long list of works on my Women Translating Classics reading list, I'm only going to name one more today, and that's a forthcoming translation of the Analects by Confucius, done by Erin Cline and due to be published in February. I've never read the Analects at all, and I might try to find a copy of a different translation at my library just for comparison. Do any of you have any recommendations of that? All right. I have one more possible reading project. I've always loved reading essays, but I seem to have fallen out of the habit in recent years. And when I read the E.B. White essays on democracy earlier this winter, I decided I really wanted to go back and read essays really regularly. A wide variety of short-form nonfiction, actually, including everything from memoiristic contemplations to book reviews and the like. I'm not quite sure that I want to bite this off, but I was thinking about making a bit of a casual series, maybe once a month or so, where I talk about a handful of the most intriguing ones that I've read. I'd love it if other people want to participate too. I've been thrilled to see Randy Ray's recent discussion of reading essays regularly, as well as Joe Spivey's videos about reading the essays of Montaigne. Well, that will do it for today. These potential reading projects are in no way rules or even serious plans, but I'd love to hear what interests you most, either among my thoughts or your own ideas for how you're planning to focus some of your reading this year. Thank you so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.